Today we're going to get into using Adobe Photoshop to create a paper cutout project. With a paper cutout, it's creating the sense that we're using construction paper or some type of paper to build out a layered effect to create the illusion that we're stacking paper on top of each other to create an illustration. For this, we're going to do a standard landscape, but you can see from the example here, we're playing with the layers, having trees and hills overlapping each other, having the clouds actually go outside the original frame, and then using a drop shadow to help create that sense of layers within the design. But to begin out, we're going to look to create a new document, and the new creation that we do won't necessarily look like this one. We're going to create our own different design, but I can go up to File, under File, I'm going down to New. And for our document, we want to first make it a large enough document that is visibly seen. So I'm going to click on Print at the top navigation. And I'm going to change my settings. Right now, it is the standard letter size 8.5 by 11. I'm going to change this to 8.5 by 8.5 to maintain a square document. And we have it set in inches. And the resolution is 300. That's DPI, or dots per inch. My color mode is going to say RGB. That way it gives me some more vibrant colors. And the white background can stay as is. We're going to look to place in a color anyway. So I can click Create. Now we take a look over on the bottom right side. We have our background layer. I'm going to start out by placing in a background color. I can change out my foreground color. I'm going to use a light blue color and click OK. And I can use the paint bucket tool on the left side navigation, located underneath the gradient tool. And with the paint bucket, I simply click inside the area, and then I have that light blue color. I'm going to create a new layer down the bottom right. And I'm going to make sure to name my layers each time I create a new layer. I'm going to call this Sun. With the elliptical marquee tool, or lip select in Photopea, I can look to draw out a circular shape. And to create a perfect circle, hold down Shift. I can always move the location while still on the elliptical marquee tool, or lip select, into the correct location, or where I want it. Now I'm going to look to fill this in, and I'm going to pick out more of a yellow color. Make it a little bit more vibrant. And again, using the paint bucket tool to fill inside the area. I can deselect. And I'm going to now create a new layer. I'm going to call this Sky 1. And we're going to create the illusion that's radiating outward from the sun, getting darker as it goes further away. I'm going to click over on the elliptical marquee tool again. Going to look to draw outside of the sun area. So I'm going to start up and to the left side. I can click and drag down to the right. I'm going to do my best to have it located right in the middle of the sun, but I can always use my arrow keys to nudge it if I don't feel like it's in the center. But we're not actually going to look to fill inside the area. We're actually going to invert our selection, so we're going to be filling outside of the circle. So I'm going to go to Select, Inverse, and we can see the dotted lines are now appearing around the outside edge of the image. And I'm going to change my foreground color. I'm going to maintain consistency from the blue that I originally chose, but I'm going to create darker variations from this. So I'm going to go around the top of the color picker to get a darker blue. And again, use the paint bucket tool to fill in this area. I'm going to deselect. Command D on a Mac, Control D on Windows machine. Again, create a new layer. Go back to the elliptical marquee tool. Click and drag. And I can use the arrow keys again to nudge it into place. or I can, while still selected on the elliptical marquee tool, move it to where I want it. Make sure it's in the middle as best possible. Again, I'm going to invert my selection, select inverse, and again use a darker variation of this blue. Click inside the area, we'll get that more vivid blue, creating a new layer. And again, make sure to name your layers, so I can call it Sky 2 for this last one, and now Sky 3. With Sky 3, I'm going to deselect again, use the elliptical marquee tool, starting from up and to the left, holding shift. I can nudge it into place. And again, invert my selection, select inverse, picking out another darker variation of the blue. Using the paint bucket, fill it in again. Deselect, and I'm going to do one more ring just for creating a little bit more radiation. Elliptical marquee tool, click and drag. I can make this a little bit bigger overall too. Create that new layer before we do fill it in, Sky 4. Invert my selection, select inverse, pick out that darker blue, and paint in the area with the paint bucket. And then I can deselect, and we see how it starts to radiate from that yellow color into the different blue tones. Eventually we will add in a drop shadow. If I wanted to test out the drop shadow right now, I can look to start out with the sun layer. I'm going to go down to FX at the bottom of the layers panel. Click on drop shadow. And you can see that it does start to apply in a shadow on the sun. I'm going to look to blur this out a little bit more, drop down the opacity, it's a little bit strong. I'm going to maintain a low spread. I want to focus more on the distance and the size. I have to imagine where I want the light source to come from. So if I want it a little bit from the top, I'm going to maintain the distance and the angle of the light source. It's going to be projecting a little bit downward. Or I can adjust it if I wanted to decide that I wanted a angle where the shadow was projecting up. You can see how it affects the shadow. Or I could make it more of an angled variation. Maybe I want to go off to the slightly to the side. So I'll do negative 145 degrees. You see how it goes up to the right. If I want to use the same shadow for the other layers, I can right click where it says effects for this layer. And I'm going to copy layer style. And all I have to do is right click on each layer and paste in the layer style, and it applies into the other layers. Paste layer style, and you see the difference where the sun is projecting the shadow behind it up and to the right, but the blue layers that are radiating outward, because they're on top of the sun and a hole is cut inside of them, the shadow is casting on the bottom left side. But I can again repeat this process, paste layer style, and one more time, paste layer style. And you see how it starts to radiate, that these shadows were layers of pieces of paper stacked on top of each other. So now that I have my sky, I want to look into add some details. We're going to get into looking at clouds. So to build out more cloud shapes, there's different variations of way to create clouds. I'm going to create a new layer called Cloud 1. And again, I'm going to use the elliptical marquee tool. With the elliptical marquee tool, I can start out by drawing out oval shapes, and I'm going to hold down Shift to maintain and be able to combine shapes together. So the more little ovals I combine, it starts to become more of a cloud shape. But I can also draw clouds separately, and again attach those circles together as their own separate cloud. But there's different ways of drawing clouds. It's kind of for you to determine what style you like. If I wanted to fill these clouds in, I can go with, again, I have the Cloud 1 layer selected. I'm not going to pick a pure white color. I'm going to create a little bit of difference. Again, a lighter blue, but using the paint bucket tool, I'm going to click inside one of them, and you see that it fills inside all 3 layers. I can deselect. If I want to move these around, change the placement, I can do that. Or maybe I want to think about a different style. But if I wanted to apply the shadow again, I can simply right click on the layer, paste layer style, and you see how the shadow affects the clouds down. If I wanted to change the sharpness of the cloud or blur it out more, I can double click on the drop shadow in the effects on Cloud 1. And if I were to change this, pushing up the size, you see that it blurs out more on the clouds. Or if I wanted to push up the distance, I could change the location a little bit. You see how it affects the image overall. But I'm going to cancel that. And I'm actually going to hide these clouds, and I'm going to create a little bit ones that I think fit better to the design. So I'm going to click back over on the new layer. Call this Cloud 2. And again, using the elliptical marquee tool, and click and drag to create more circle effect. I can use larger circles if I'm not going to end up using all of them, but I can use smaller ones and variations if I wanted to create more that it's one huge cloud overall. Or a couple smaller variations inside as well. So if I were to fill this in, again using the paint bucket tool, click inside the area, see a larger cloud. But again, it's for you to kind of settle on the type of cloud that you're looking for. They can be bigger ones. You can look to stack these up. If I wanted to create a new layer again, and maybe create some layering effect, I can use the elliptical marquee tool. Drawing the outside ones first. But again, holding down Shift so that I can combine these onto one shape. When I want to fill this in, again, I'm going to pick out a lighter color just because it's in front of the other one. And use the paint bucket tool to fill it in. I can deselect. You can see how the lighter version is sitting on top of the darker one. I can change the placement, look for a different arrangement. But you can see how it's cut off from the edge because that's where I originally started to build out the design. But again, it's up to you to figure out what type of style you want. I'm actually going to go back to the original style that we had. Or if I wanted to create a third style, I can use a more flattened version where I stack up the tops and sides with a more circular look. But if I wanted to cut off the bottom, I can use the rectangle marquee tool, hold down Alt on a Windows or hold down Option on a Mac, and I can click and drag to create a rectangle that's going to cut off the bottom, and we see a flat version of the cloud shape. Or again, I can do the same thing, combine and go in between the two. Hold down Shift, draw out the oval shape. Again, going back to the rectangle marquee tool, hold down Option, it cuts off the bottom. Now if I were to look into fill these in, use the paint bucket tool, click inside, and you see the difference with these cloud shapes. So I got to move these around, or again look to stack these with other clouds. So if I wanted to create more clouds, create a new layer. And again, doing the same process with the elliptical marquee tool. With the rectangle select and holding down Option, cutting off the bottom, and going back again with the elliptical marquee tool. So I'm going to do one that gets a little bit bigger, but also crosses over with the smaller versions. Create a third just to add again a little bit more depth. Picking out a different color. Again, these are just the flat versions before we get into adding ingredients. But I created that new layer. I can rename it in a moment. Deselect. I'm going to look to place this behind the other two. So now you can see that the smaller one is sitting in front of this one. If I want to lighten this up at all, I can go up to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. I can adjust on the Hue and Saturation bar. I'm going to drop the lightness down. And then I'm going to modify the other two clouds. Go a little bit lighter with these. Hue and Saturation again, just dropping the lightness. So not a pure white, but definitely lighter, closer to that. So I can always move these around. I'm using the auto select with the move tool. I can click and drag, find area that I like them. match the color using the eyedropper tool on the left side, and use the paint bucket to fill in this area. I have the correct layer for the cloud selected, so you see that disappears. But now that we have more of the sky, I can look to start adding in some land. I'm going to rename my clouds for a moment. So clouds front, clouds back. Obviously I don't need the other clouds from before, but I've just hid those layers. Click on the little eye icon, so I don't need them. But again, we can right click on the layer and paste layer style. You see that it applies the drop shadow onto the clouds. And same thing, right click, paste layer style. Now the clouds have the shadows. Now we're going to look to create more of a landscape. With the landscape, I'm kind of go back and forth. I may start to build out the more foreground layers, or think about the mountainscape that might go with it. If I have mountainscape, I may adjust the placement of the clouds overall. So I'm going to go to the top of my layers panel, create a new layer. And I can rename this layer. If I were to start out with the more mountains, type in mountain layer. You can think again about stacking multiple layers so to create that more sense of depth. If I want to maintain consistency of using simple shapes, I can look to use the Polygonal Lasso tool, third tool left side navigation, in which I could do a more zigzag, clicking up and down, creating the breaks inside the mountain. I can do high mountain, but I'm going to look to fill in the whole bottom of this, as I can put layers on top of this later on. But I'm going to fill this in. And for consistency purposes, I'm going to be picking more of a blue-gray color for the mountains. And use the paint bucket tool to fill in the area. You can see again how the mountains block over some of the clouds. You can deselect. And if I wanted to try seeing what it looks like with the clouds above it, I can move my mountain layer down on the bottom navigation. Or again, I can move my clouds out of the way, changing the placement a little bit. Maybe create another layer for Mountain 2. Again, creating this sense that it's stacking other mountains in front of some. If I mess up on my clicks, I can always hit delete to undo a selection or a click. And then again, looking to combine it back to the beginning, I'm going to fill this in again. This time pick a darker variation of this blue-gray color. Use the paint bucket, fill it in, deselect. And even though that this runs all the way down to the bottom, I'm likely going to use the canvas to kind of fill in this area with more hills. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so I can use the elliptical marquee tool in larger size. So I can modify, move it around before I do fill in the area. Or I can do more freehand shape. Or I can look to use the pen tool. The pen tool gives me a lot more control, but it's not necessarily as consistent as it is with Adobe Illustrator. I definitely prefer the Illustrator pen tool in comparison to the Photoshop one. But with the pen tool, I can click and drag to create more rolling hills, bending the line, clicking, dragging to create the curves. And again, I'm going to go around the outside and then combine it back to the original point that I made. I'm going to look to fill in this area, but I'm going to create a new layer to fill this in. Once I have it, I can click on shape at the top navigation, and I can look to change out the color. I can double click right on the shape layer and pick out a different color. So if I wanted to pick out more of a green, you see how it affects the image overall. And I'll pick out something a little bit more vibrant. And I'm going to go back to the pen tool to draw this out. But I'm going to create a new layer for this as well. Again, using the pen tool. Again, going around the outside to select around the area. I'm going to click on shape at the top. And it fills in with this blue color from originally before, but I can double click on the shape to change the layer. I can pick out a little bit more vivid green. Again, if I want to create some depth, I'm going to look to right click and paste layer style. This is the layer style on each of the layers. Again, creating that variation. And if I'm not happy with the clouds, I can always move them around, change the location. If I'm not necessarily happy with specific part of the mountain, I can always look to select around the outside of the mountain. So I have this current cloud shape selected. I can use the move tool now and slide it to a different location. this up. I'm going to switch over to the front cloud, click and drag a box around this one, and use the move tool, and I can now slide this one to where I want it. Maybe it overlaps, maybe it doesn't. It's kind of up to you to figure out. But I can deselect. So we have some mountains, we have some hills. If I decided that I want to put some water in this, I can look to break up some of this land, maybe create some ripples and create some depth within the, like a water area. So I'm going to go back over to my shape at the top. And I'm going to simply just use a elliptical marquee tool, draw out an oval shape. And with the shape 2, I need to rasterize it first before I can make any modifications. So I'm going to right click on the layer, rasterize layer, and now when I click on backspace, it will cut out that area. I'm also going to cut out the area on the shapes layer, the shape 1, which is that green background hill. I need to rasterize that layer, and I can hit backspace. Now we have the mountains, and with the mountains, I don't necessarily need to do the raster. They are already rasterized layers, but I can hit backspace and cut it out. I'm going to cut out the background on this as well. And you see the blue come in because that's that blue sky that we had in the background. So that is that sky 4. And we're going to create a couple layers underneath of the sky 4 and cut out the sky 4 to create the sense that the water is going into darker territory or getting into creating depth within this, so it's not so flat. So I'm going to click on my elliptical marquee tool, slide this down a little bit down to the right, and I'm going to hit backspace. You see it goes blue, but we're going to look to place a couple layers in front, in between sky 3 and sky 4. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I can say water 2. And I'm going to slide this underneath of sky 4. I'm going to use my eyedropper tool to match the blue that I have in sky 4. But I'm going to look to pick out a darker variation of blue with the color picker. And I can use the paint bucket tool to fill in this area. I can deselect. And we're seeing that shadow from the sky 4 that already has a drop shadow. But I'm going to create another new layer. Put it below water 2 and rename this water 3. Again, using the elliptical marquee tool, and click and drag to create another ovular shape. I can move it around, change the location, again hitting I'm going to look to fill this in with a darker color, blue. So again, I have the green in the grass above the water, which is the sky 4. Underneath that, I have water 2 is giving me that light blue color, and I'm unable to see water 3 because water 2 is blocking it. So we need to cut that out. So I'm going to hit backspace on layer on water 2 and create another layer for water 3, but water 3 has to sit below water 2. I'm going to fill this in with the darker blue. And use the paint bucket tool to fill this in. Deselect. Water 2 does not have a drop shadow, but we can put the layer style on. If I feel like water 3 is a little bit too dark, I can again go back to the paint bucket tool, change out my foreground color a little bit. Just dropping that a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to now create a new layer in between, or underneath of shape 2 and shape in between shape 1. I'm going to create a new layer and call this trees. And I can use the Polygonal Lasso tool to draw more of a generic shaped pine tree. So clicking back and forth to create more of a zigzag shape. As it gets more narrow as it goes upward. And try to mirror the same thing over on the other side. Redraw it, get a little bit better shape. If I want, I can add in more trees all at once. I can hold down Shift, begin drawing out one tree. Just clicking back and forth. And rather than going all the way down, I may want to cut back up and begin drawing out some trees to the side. So I can do all these trees at once. You can do some smaller ones in comparison to larger ones. And again, remember you can hit delete if you accidentally mess up. I'm going to go back to where I started. Because this is behind shape 2, I'm going to fill this in with a darker green. Use the paint bucket tool. Once I click in one, see it fills in the others. But I'm going to move this behind shape 1 so that it's appearing behind. And again, place the drop shadow, paste layer style. If I wanted to create a little bit more variation, I can use the Polygonal Lasso tool, draw on 1/2 of the tree. Do the same thing, hold down Shift for the other trees as well. Hold down Shift, let go Shift. And to create some variation on the trees, I'm going to lighten up the left side, image adjustments, hue and saturation, drop the lightness a little bit. You can see it affects the color of the tree over on the left side, but nothing else. Again, image adjustments, hue and saturation, slide the lightness down. Let's create some variation on the tree, adding in some simple highlights before we get into the more complicated variation. I can deselect, Control D. Again, it looks like we kind of folded the paper to create the trees. And you can add many more trees, or if I wanted to add in some hills behind the trees, I can create a new layer sitting behind the tree layer. It's a small mountain. Again, I'm going to use the pen tool this time. And go back around to where I started the shape, close it up. And to close up the shape and make it a shape, I'm going to click on Shape at the top navigation. We can see this dark green color, but I can change the color, double click on the small mountain layer. And I'm going to make this more of a brownish color. Or I can make it more of a blue tone, or intermediate. Click OK, and move this layer behind the trees. And again, when we want to put the drop shadow, we have to rasterize the layer. Right click on the layer, rasterize layer first, and then I can put the paste layer style. Again, we see that variation. Now we're going to look to place in the highlights and shadowed areas. Realistically, we'll only have the shadows on the sun and the clouds. The mountains and waters and all that, they all have an ending point on the bottom, so they don't need it. So we can start out with the sun. We're going to look to duplicate the layer. I can right click on the layer, duplicate layer. And I'm going to rename this sun highlight. Click OK. Use the magic wand to select the yellow color I have for the sun. And instead of using a flat yellow, I'm going to use an eyedropper to match the yellow that we currently have. And then I'm going to click on the background color to choose out, again, this yellow, but I'm going to look to adjust this now towards more a orange color for the bottom of the sun. I'm going to look to change the paint bucket to the gradient tool. I'm going to draw a gradient from top to bottom of the sun. I want to make sure that I'm using the default setup for the brush, so I'm going to click on the basics. In the drop down for basics, I can choose out the yellow orange that I have for the foreground background. And now when I draw it out, we get that sun where it starts as yellow and then transfers into orange. I want to redraw it a couple times, or maybe have more yellow in it. I can redraw it a little bit lower. And you technically want to do this with the original sun layer. Click and drag, create that sun. But with the sun highlight layer, we're going to have it selected. And I'm going to click back on the elliptical marquee tool. With the elliptical marquee tool, I'm not selecting on the sun. So we want to make sure that we're selected on the elliptical marquee tool or the ellipse select. I can nudge this downward, leaving the top of the yellow on the top edge. You zoom in so you can get a little bit closer look. See how the yellow is left on the top here. I'm going to hit backspace. That cuts out part of the sun area, and I do not want to have the effects still applied with the drop shadow, so I'm going to throw this away in the trash. And I'm going to deselect. It's important that you deselect, Control D or Command D on a Mac. And we're going to look to change the color of this highlight, making it lighter. To make it lighter, we're going to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and you're going to drop the lightness downward. And as I drop the lightness downward, this is a little bit more difficult to see, but it is a lighter yellow now, but it adds in that nice little highlight effect. I don't want to go too white, but I can click OK. Then we're going to look to duplicate the sun again. Right-click, Duplicate Layer. I'm going to rename the sun Shadow. Click OK. Delete out the effects. Use the magic wand to select the sun. If it doesn't select the whole thing, hold down Shift, select out the rest of it. But we're going to use the arrow keys to now nudge it upward, leaving the bottom portion of this sun shadow. I can hit backspace, then I'm going to deselect, and then I'm going to go back up to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. This time I'm going to drop the lightness down to the left. You can see that it does add that shadow on the sun, but mine's a little bit too dark right now. I can lighten that up. You always want to make it something subtle. Click OK. So now we have the highlight, we have the shadow. We're going to be looking to do this for all the layers, starting with that Sky 2. But the real ones that we definitely want to get are the clouds. We'll see how we do it with this second blue color, the Sky 1. Again, I'm going to duplicate the layer. I can click and drag it right onto the new layer icon. It automatically makes a duplicate. I can rename this layer Sky Highlight. Delete out the effects. Use the magic wand tool to click on the blue, the sky. And we want to have the highlight now on the bottom side. It's a little bit confusing to understand, but remember it's a cutout. So we want to see the shadow on the bottom. So I'm going to slide this down with my arrow keys. Then I'm going to now hit backspace. That leaves just this little rim on the bottom edge. I'm going to deselect, Control D, then go back up to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. It's going to be a repetitive process for this, but it will help create some variation. You can see that highlight now applying on the outer edge on the bottom here. And click OK. But we also want to think about the gradient. So I'm going to select on my Sky 1, use the eyedropper tool to match that blue of the sky that we have. I'm going to then click on the background color, use again the eyedropper tool to match that blue, but I'm going to pick out a darker blue of this color. Then use the gradient tool, click and drag to create a gradient that travels from top to bottom. We want to make sure that we have the object selected when we do this. So with the gradient tool, I have the object selected. Click and drag. You see now that as I click and drag, it creates that highlight, or it goes from lighter to darker. It's subtle, but it really does help make a difference in the end. I can deselect. Again, that highlight's right on the outer edge. If I feel like the highlight's too much, I can always lighten it up again. And go Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, maybe darken it up, drop the lightness down a little bit. And click OK. So if I do the gradient for the next layer, Sky 2, I'm going to duplicate first select it with the magic wand, clicking on the inside edge of that blue. This time I'm going to use the eyedropper tool, match the blue color, Then I'm going to use the eyedropper tool, match that blue color as well, but make a darker variation. Use the gradient tool to draw out that gradient. You see how it darkens up on the bottom portion. And you can see it in the little thumbnail as well, where it goes from lighter to darker. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer. Throw away the effects. I don't need those. I can throw them in the trash. I can rename this highlight so we get a little bit more understanding. Then use the arrow keys to nudge the location. Again, make sure that we're on the elliptical marquee tool, or you can be on the magic wand, but we're going to nudge this downward, creating that little gap on the bottom edge. Hit backspace, cutting out majority of that layer except for that little rim. Deselect, Control D, or Command D on a Mac. Image adjustments, hue and saturation. Push the lightness up. Again, you can see that little highlight added on there, and we're starting to build out the highlights overall on these objects. Click OK. Same thing with the next blue layer. Use the eyedropper tool and match the blue color that we have. Click on the background color. Then use the eyedropper again to match that color, but click out a darker blue variation. Use the magic wand to make sure that we're selected on that color of the layer. Use the gradient tool. Click and drag it downward, creating that lighter, darker transition. And you may not be seeing much difference, but if you see the difference in this little thumbnail, again, you can see that different variation. I don't want to necessarily make it overwhelming, but just enough to create some difference overall. If it helps to hide out the clouds, just for better understanding, I'll hide those out for a moment. And deselect. Actually, I'm not going to deselect. I'm going to just use the arrow keys, nudge it downward with the elliptical marquee tool selected. Again, we have that Sky 3 duplicate. Or we want to create that duplicate, right click on the layer, duplicate layer. I'm going to call it highlight. Hit backspace. And make sure to delete out the effects. Deselect. And then I'm going to go back up to image adjustments, hue and saturation, modify the lightness. See that highlight come up into the image. I'll click OK. And we'll do it finally for the last blue part of the sky. We're going to go over to Sky 4. Use the magic wand to select it. Use the eyedropper to match the color of the sky. Then click on the background color, adjust this down to darker blue. Then redraw out the color with the gradient, click and drag downward. You see when I did that, it definitely darkened up down here. It also darkened up down here, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I'm going to look to duplicate this layer, drop it onto the new layer icon, delete out the effects, nudge the arrows down, and I'm going to hit backspace. Cuts out majority in the copy, which we can rename highlight. Deselect, and then go back up to image adjustments, hue and saturation, slide the lightness up. See that little highlight added on the bottom right edge here. Doesn't really affect anything else. It's just a small piece, but it still just adds into the overall design. Then we're going to look to do this with the mountains as well. We can click on the largest mountains. I'm going to use the magic wand to select the mountains. I'm going to use the eyedropper. Match that gray. If I'm not necessarily satisfied with the color, I can change a little bit. I'm going to pick out a lighter blue. Use the eyedropper to match that lighter blue color I just picked. But now create a little bit darker version. Click OK. Use the gradient tool to draw out that gradient. It travels down the mountain. Now you'll start to see the real differences between the gradients. Again, if I did a short gradient, you can kind of see the harshness of the difference, but we're doing real more subtle variation. I'm going to look to duplicate this layer, bring it down to the new layer icon, delete out the effects. Use arrow keys to nudge it down, just leaving that upper edge. And I can slide this a little bit to the left because I want to imagine that the sun is creating that highlight. So I'm going to hit backspace, cuts it out in the thumbnail, you can easily see it. You can deselect, then again go back up to image adjustments, hue and saturation, drop the lightness or pull the lightness up. Now you can see that highlight really stand out a little bit stronger in the mountains. Now we're going to repeat that process again for all the other pieces. Click on the second mountains. Dropper. I'm actually going to pick up the dark part of this mountain and now darken this up a little bit. And click on the background. Again, picking out the foreground color but darkening this up. Now use the gradient tool. Make sure to select the object first. Now draw out with the magic wand, or draw it out with a gradient tool. Click and drag from top down to the bottom. Again, you can see how it just changed the color a little bit. I wanted something a little bit more vibrant than the gray color that I had. I'm going to duplicate the mountain 2, delete out the effects, use the arrow keys to nudge it down. And I can slide a little bit to the left. Hit backspace to cut that area out. Deselect. Image adjustments, brightness and image adjustments, hue and saturation, set the lightness up. Again, you see that highlight placing on it. Click OK. And continue to repeat that process on the pieces that are building up. Select out the shape. I have the foreground color. Now I'm going to click on the background color. Use the eyedropper, match that color, but slide over to a little bit more. Then use the grading tool to redraw it. You can see it a little bit better when I draw it out this way. And then deselect. So you really don't want to deselect. I'm going to duplicate the layer. Delete out the effects. Use the arrow keys, nudge it downward. Slide a little bit to the left. Hit backspace, cut out that majority, deselect. Image adjustments, hue and saturation, slide to the left, or to the right. Get that highlight. Again, it doesn't need to be too bright and vivid, but just enough. Now I can do the same thing for the trees. So we're just slowly going up the layers panel. With the trees, I will likely have to do this process again of cutting the half color and brightening it up. So let me select out the pieces first. Use the eyedropper. Match the screen color. That's a green color for the background. But let's darken this up. Now let's redraw it with the gradient tool. Click and drag downward. So I drew slightly to the left because we had that tree up higher on the left side there. Now that I have the highlight or the gradient, I'm going to duplicate the layer, throw away the effects, use the arrow keys to nudge it downward, a little bit to the left, and a little bit back up. You can zoom in closer just so you can see the difference. But I'm going to hit backspace to cut out on the tree copy, which is the highlight layer. Deselect, image adjustments, brightness and contrast, or hue and saturation, drop the lightness to the right, get that little highlight on the trees. Then again, if I want to add in that coloring effect that I did, cutting it out, I'm going to draw around the outside shape of one, hold down shift, repeat the process, drawing on the outside shape. Hold down shift, let go. We want to kind of match to the shape. Again, we want to close out the shape. Hold down shift, let go. But again, I'm going to follow that same process, image adjustments, brightness and contrast. Hue and saturation, slide it up to the right. I don't want to do too much, I still want to maintain that highlight. So I can then deselect, or click OK and deselect. So I still have that same element in there on the trees. And I can do this for the hills and the water. Eyedropper, match the color. Do it for the bottom of the hill. Use the magic wand, select it. Draw out with the gradient. Well, I have to do it for the visible area, but you see the difference when I draw it out, how it applies onto the hills. Again, I'm going to duplicate the layer, throw away the effects, use the arrow keys to nudge it downward, a little bit to the left, backspace, deselect, image adjustments, hue and saturation, slide that up to the right, get that little highlight on there, click OK. Shape 2 in front of it. Magic wand, select it out. eyedropper, match the color. Background, match the color of the foreground. Slide it up to the right. Draw it out with the gradient tool. Again, you can see the difference. Now with that gradient, I'm going to duplicate the layer, throw away the effects. Arrow keys, nudge it down, location, a little bit to the left. Backspace, cut it out. Deselect. Image adjustments, hue and saturation. Again, adding in that little highlight. I'm going to go back to the sky and look now to place in the shadow. And actually I can do the shadow for the shapes too here. I'm going to duplicate the layer. Throw away the effects again. Use the magic wand tool again to select it. I can hold down shift to select the areas that if it didn't select it entirely. Use arrow keys, nudge it upward this time for the shadow. I'm going to hit backspace to cut it out. Deselect. This time image adjustments, hue and saturation, drop the lightness down to the left. Again, we'll add that little highlight or that little shadow on the bottom left. I'm going to deselect. Now it looks more like paper is stacked up on top of the blue and on top of this lighter green color. For the Sky 4, I'm going to look to duplicate it out again. This time rename it Sky 4 Shadow. Because again, it's going to be going into the water. Use the magic wand to select it. And hold down shift, select it on the top portion here. I'm going to throw away the effects, don't need that. And we're going to then nudge it up with the arrow keys. Backspace, deselect. This time go back up to image adjustments, hue and saturation, drop the lightness down. You see that shadow apply down on this layer, but it also does the little shadow up on the top left here. Click OK. Again, select the layer below. Water 2. We're just looking to do the shadow portion. I'm going to select it first. Use the eyedropper tool. I want to create darker variation because this is too light now that it matches to the other color here. But we can create darker shadow. Use the gradient tool, draw it out. Now you can see the difference on the ground there. I'm going to look to duplicate the water 2, throw away the effects. Use the arrow keys to nudge it upward. Backspace, cut it out. Deselect. Image adjustments, hue and saturation. Drop the lightness down. Now we got that shadow in there. And then our bottom layer, this bottom water, same thing, we're looking to add in that shadow. So water 3. Use the magic wand, select it. Eyedropper tool, select out the color, but we're going to get a darker variation. Gradient, draw out the gradient. You see it gets darker. Deselect. Duplicate the layer. Be sure to select it, then we can use the arrow keys to nudge the location. Backspace, cut it out. Deselect. Then we're going to go back up to image adjustments. Hue and Saturation. Drop the lightness down. Just match it on the bottom edge here, you can see. Click OK. Then I'm going to reveal back the clouds. Do this for the clouds as well. With the clouds front and back. We'll do the back first. So with the clouds, I'm going to select it with the magic wand. Hold down Shift to select out all three of them at once. Eyedropper tool. Click on the background. Eyedropper tool, the same color. Get that darker variation of blue. And I may want to actually do this one at a time, because if I do apply the gradient at the same time, it's just going to give that darker variation on the bottom. So I'm going to deselect, use the magic wand, undo, deselect, select it out with the magic wand, draw it out individually one at a time, click and drag on each cloud, use that gradient, back to the magic wand. And there are shortcut keys for these. If you hit W, you get to the magic wand tool very easy. And then if you click on G, you get to the gradient tool very easily. With the gradient tool, draw from top to bottom. You kind of vary it up. And finally, the last one, select on the cloud, click on G, redo the gradient, and deselect. Go to duplicate this layer, throw away the effects. Again, we want to need all three of these selected. I can hold down Shift to select out both sections because it now has that gradient on it. I can use the arrow keys, and I'm going to nudge it downward. Then I'm going to hit backspace, cutting out the majority of it. Deselect, image adjustments, hue and saturation, lighten this up. You can see the highlight on the object and click OK. Then again, we're going to duplicate the cloud back again, throw away the effects. Make sure to select them again, hold down Shift. This time we're going to nudge it upward for the shadows. Hit backspace, cut it out, deselect, image adjustments, hue and saturation. Drop the lightness down this time. Now we've got those clouds, we can reveal clouds front. Select the mountains first, or the clouds first. Hold Shift to select both at the same time. Eyedropper, match the color. Click on the background, match the color again. This time slide up. Get that darker variation. Click and drag from top to bottom. See how it draws out that shadow. Deselect. I'm not going to deselect. I'm going to Control Z if I mess up on the selection. But we're going to duplicate the layer now. Throw away the effects. I can rename this cloud highlight. Use the eyedropper tool, or use the arrow keys, lower it down to the bottom. Hit backspace, cut it out, deselect. adjustments, hue and saturation, put the lightness up. This one I might go all the way or closer to the right. It's not really going to apply to the edge, except where you can see it's more of a blue tone. Click OK though. Again, we're going to repeat that process. Duplicate the front. Throw away the effects. Again, use the magic wand tool to select. I'm going to use the arrow keys to slide it upward. Hit backspace. Deselect. Use image adjustments, hue and saturation. Again, sliding the lightness down. Adds in that shadow on the bottom edge. And click OK. Now that we have all these highlights, I'm going to add in one more shape and overall to give a border for the design. I'm going to go back to the top layers. I'm actually going to move my cloud layers for my cloud front to the top. And I'm going to create a new layer above that for right now. We'll eventually move that down. But we're going to call this frame. I'm going to use the rectangle marquee tool, draw out a rectangle on the inside edge, maintaining the same distance on all four corners. So I can use the arrow keys again to nudge it. But we're going to look to fill in the frame on the outside, so we have to invert our selection. I'm going to fill this in with a light bluish white color. Use the paint bucket tool, or we can use a gradient to travel from lighter to darker. So we see it on the outer edge. I'm going to deselect. So we're not going to deselect. I'm going to duplicate this layer. Slide the arrow keys downward. A little bit to the right. I'm going to hit backspace, cutting out that major portion. Deselect. Image adjustments. Image adjustments. Hue and saturation. Slide the lightness over to the right. We're adding in that little white highlight at the bottom edge, and actually at the top edge as well. You can't really see it, but click OK. We're going to select back on the actual frame layer and add in that drop shadow. Right click on the layer, paste layer style. Paste in the drop shadow, and I can modify this drop shadow a little bit. I'm going to double click on drop shadow, make it a little bit darker. I'm going to maintain the angle, but change the distance and size a little bit, just for this layer itself, just so we can create that shadow overall around all four sides. So if I wanted to, I could actually duplicate the frame out with the highlight on it. I'm going to hit Control or Command T, and on a Mac, Control T for a Windows machine. I'm going to scale this downward on the inside, on the bottom and top, again maintaining the same distance. I'm going to hit enter. Again, we're creating a little frame, but I'm actually going to slide this behind the original frame. We see that we create a double indent. Kind of framing the picture overall. And if I wanted to play with a little bit more variation, I could look to move my cloud front with the highlights and shadow on top of everything. Use the arrow keys to adjust this a little bit. Use the selection tool, or the rectangle select, use the move tool. Slide this over the edge. You see how I kind of played with it a little bit more. But just creating a little bit more interest, playing with the perception that the layers are a little bit more vivid and dynamic because they play with that spatial element with the frame. The last element we're going to add in is a texture to make it more paper-like. I'm going to go up to File, down to Place Embedded. I'm going to grab a texture that I've already chosen out. Pick on this texture fabric and click Place. I'm going to scale this out so it expands over top of the entire image. Click Enter. So it's a brown texture, but we're going to use the blending options to make it blend in. You can see that you get a different effect every time you place a different setting on the picture. So I can scroll down through the different options to see how it's going to affect the image. I do like the overlay look on this one. Still has that nice little texture. If I feel like it dulls down the color too much, I can always look and soften it up. Lightness works out great, maintaining most of the color. So I think I'm going to stay with that one, but I can see the different variations in between. See how that texture applies onto each of the layers. Just for creating something a little bit more vivid, I'm going to pick out this vivid light and drop down the opacity so it's not as strong, but gives a nice subtle paper feel overall. Then I'm going to look to save it, and I have a design. Hope you enjoy this tutorial.